Thank you, Director General, for your insightful speech. We all know that Finland is leading in applied education. As Director General has mentioned, work-based learning is high on the VPET's agenda.
You know, Peter, Director General led a delegation to visit Hong Kong in 2018.
As soon as the current crisis is over, we look forward to inviting you to Hong Kong soon, Director General.
Now, it's our privilege to have Professor Sir Chris Husbands, Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University, United Kingdom, as our keynote speaker.
Professor Sir Chris Husband is an advisor of local and national governments of the United Kingdom and a renowned higher educationist internationally.
Please welcome Professor Sir Chris Husbands.
Hello everybody, my name is Chris Husbands. I'm Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. I'm obviously very sorry not to be physically with you in Hong Kong to talk about vocational education. I very much enjoy my visits to Hong Kong and I'm missing not being there. But because of circumstances, I'm talking to you from home, and in order to share what I want to share with you, I'm going to need to work through a series of slides, and I'm just about to share my screen in order to make that easier. So in the time I've got with you, I want to set out three arguments about how making vocational education work in an incredibly rapid changing world. First, I want to set out an argument about the demands on education, skill, and the economy in the 21st century. Secondly, I want to talk about gearing the education system around those demands. And thirdly, I want to talk about what we know about the conditions for success. And to do this, I'm going to draw on my work as an education policy analyst and as the president of Sheffield Hallam University, which is one of the UK's largest, most successful and most vocationally oriented universities. So I want to start here. It's a picture which in all sorts of ways seems incredibly remote. It's not just the obvious things that make it different, the monochrome photo, the technologies, the hairstyles, the fashions. It seems to come from a different world. It's a photograph of a Hong Kong textile factory in the 1950s, and it's a picture of its time. The workforce, here all women, similar in age and in dress, the routinized nature of the work, relatively low skill and repetitive, closely supervised, dominated by routines. It's a typical photograph of a typical factory. Now, of course, it's not as remote as it seems. My own mother worked in textile factories doing pretty much this sort of job until she retired from work in the 1990s. And any of us could find similar factories perhaps in Chittagong or Shenzhen. It looks, however, and feels like a different world because it is. It's a world only just out of reach. And the remarkable thing is not that it's a picture of the past, but it looks like a different world. We all believe, and we're right to believe, that work and the demands of work are changing rapidly. And we can see this in all sorts of ways. Perhaps the most familiar way to look at it is this now widely used labour market map produced over the last 20 years by Dick Murnane and his colleagues that map trends in skill demand for labour in the United States, although the picture in other advanced economies is not much difference. And we see, and you can see it as the slide works through, the collapse of demand for relatively low cognitive load routine skills and the expansion of demand for high cognitive load interactive skills. The labour market is expecting radically different things from what it was expecting a generation ago. Now, education is not simply about preparation for the labour market, but it is partly driven by the labour market. And the main graph, in all sorts of different ways, drives education and vocational education policies all around the world. This challenge frames a key policy choice in almost every country. And I think it's put at its most succinct by Andreas Schleicher, the chief analyst at the OECD, who says this: you have two choices. You can go to the race to the bottom, lowering wages for low skilled jobs, or you can try to win in innovation and competitiveness. In the long run, if you don't have natural resources to sell, skills are the only way of competing. And that is the key economic challenge for education policymakers in the 21st century. We have to develop routes to the cultivation of high skills that equip all our young people to thrive in highly unpredictable, digitally enabled, and, as we've all discovered in painful ways in the last 4 months, tightly interconnected world. My policy question is how we build highly effective skills pathways. Now, it turns out that education systems are very poorly geared for responsive change. If I put this slide up, and these are slides of lecture theatres all around the world, you probably see the problem. These are my photographs of lecture rooms that I've been in or looked at, and what do you notice? You notice that they're all the same, and they're all dominated by a particular view of what knowledge and the transmission of knowledge looks like. And I'm afraid it gets a bit worse than that. If you compare them with this picture, and this is a picture of Michael Faraday lecturing to the Royal Institution in the 1850s, you'll see another problem. Not only a lack of receptiveness to context, but a lack of receptiveness to change. Of course, I'm exaggerating for effect, but the key argument is that education systems left to themselves do some predictable things. The first thing they do is that they tend to reproduce themselves. And in one sense, that's what we want them to do. Education is one way we socialize the young, and we use it to pass on, and in general, this is a good thing, core, deep knowledge on which social cohesion and active citizenship depend. But they tend also towards stasis, as these slides suggest. And if this is all they do, they become unresponsive to changing demands. The second thing they do is that they change much more slowly than the economy around them. This isn't universally true, but I think the evidence is quite strong that education adapts to the economy rather than shaping it, unless some very deliberate interventions are made. And the third thing education systems do, by and large, is they reproduce the inequalities and hierarchies that exist in society. And that's because the moneyed elites in every society, in every age, tend to prioritize investment in the success of their own children, sending them to elite institutions that change more slowly than other institutions because they don't need to change. And this is in all sorts of ways the classic problem of the relationship between education and the economy, put at its most, again, characteristically succinct in the title of Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz's book, The Race Between Education and Technology, which looks at the experience of the United States at the end of the 20th century. Now, I'm making an argument quickly because time is tight, but this tendency of education systems to stasis is a real problem given the policy challenge I set out in the first section of this talk. So the real question for policymakers is how to prod, push, goad, encourage, bully or force education systems to do things differently. How do we gear education systems for change? And here, the evidence is both good and bad. The first thing to say is that governments, although they're incredibly important and essential in what I'm going to say, turn out to be very bad planners. Governments are no better than the rest of us in predicting change and its impacts. This is a very good time to make this point. In my own country, government did have a very good risk register. And the risk register said that the number one national risk was a global pandemic. And it did a very good planning exercise in 2016 to game plan its response to a pandemic. But when the COVID pandemic hit, it turned out to be no better than anybody else, and in some ways a lot worse than in meeting the challenge. Governments are no better than the rest of us in predicting the future, certainly not in predicting the demand for skills in the future. The economy is too unpredictable for that. To make matters more difficult, individual employers are also not very good at predicting skill demands in the future. And once again, there are some good reasons for this. The job of every company is to deliver success in the here and now, to provide customer service, products more efficiently and effectively than their competitors, to seek competitive advantage and to respond to short-term market signals. And this, of course, drives highly successful innovation and highly effective companies. But companies are relatively poor at predicting the future, which is why the rate of failure in the economy is normally high and why many startups fail. So we appear to have a problem. We know that the economy is changing fast and that skill demands are changing, but neither education systems nor governments nor employers are well placed to position themselves for the future. That sounds like a counsel of despair. Now, in fact, experience suggests that there are some practical ways through the problems. And I think there are 4 practical steps that can be established which effectively gear education systems to respond better to economic change. The first is to put the individual at the centre, the individual learner, not the system or the qualification structure, at the centre of everything. Everything the education and training system does. This is more than rhetoric. It should drive funding, assessment, progression, and planning. Learners, not structures, have to come first. The second is to make sure that any education system has multiple pathways to success. And there's strong evidence from around the world that education systems with strong multiple routes, what Bob Schwartz in America calls pathways to prosperity, are more successful than those with single routes. What governments need to do is to ensure that there are multiple routes through their education and training systems to allow for individual learners to thrive in multiple ways. At Sheffield Hallam, my own university, we've built multiple routes through our provision, including, and I'll come back to this a bit later, being the UK's largest provider of degree apprenticeships, full-time employees who are also on a training programme leading to a degree. The third thing to say is that whilst no individual player or sector has a monopoly on foresight, there is, I think, huge merit in what, for the sake of argument here, I'll call the pooling of partial insights. It makes enormous sense to ensure that there are strong interconnections between governments, education institutions, and employers and employer organisations. Pooling perspectives and ensuring that institutions can swap ideas and people makes a big contribution. At Sheffield Hallam, we've built a framework for close collaboration with employers and with community colleges, enabling all parties to share insights. And we're now consolidating that into what will be the UK's first regional skills council to explore skills provision needed to take the regional economy forward. And then the final step is to ensure that the system and its accountability drivers support flexible responses from organisations, whilst accepting that some of those won't work. Failure in a period of rapid change is inevitable. Mistakes happen, but flexible approaches to funding, to encouraging innovation, and to allowing institutions to experiment in responding to demands are important principles of success. Baking in inflexibilities is a recipe for ensuring that the system is not geared well. Here, Sheffield Hallam, like all universities around the world, is hampered by some pretty unhelpful influences, global league tables, for example, that tend to reinforce a single model of what a university is about. In the final part of this talk, I want to set out what I think are some principles for securing success in high quality, forward-facing vocational and advanced technical education. These are my lessons, they may not be your lessons, and in order to explain them, I want to tell you a little bit about the university I lead. So Sheffield is the UK's 5th largest city, and it's a city experiencing rapid economic change. It had a tradition of heavy industry, steel and coal that declined a generation ago, and it's going still rapid economic and social change as a result of that. It has 2 large and successful universities, and my own university, Sheffield Hallam University, is a university of some 32,000 students. It's a comprehensive university with a full range of postgraduate degree and sub-degree programmes, from healthcare to engineering, from arts to social science. I'm delighted that we won the Times and Sunday Times Award as University of the Year for Teaching Quality in 2020. We're at the heart of the city and at the heart of the city region, and at the heart of a city in which there are 45,000 small and medium-sized companies. This is a region that needs its universities, and it needs them to be dynamic and innovative. From our experience, there are 7 conditions for success. And I also, in pulling these together, have drawn on my own experience over the last 20 years as an education policy analyst around the world. And I just want to isolate and say a few things about these ingredients for success. The first, number 1 on this chart, is to understand that the future economy will not be like the old economy. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But so many of us carry pictures of the economy in our heads from our childhood, a bit like that slide I showed you of the photograph of the 1950s. And they limit our sense of what the future will be like. The future economy will be very different. Digitized, high skill, requiring more and more of employees and employers alike. Secondly, and it's easy to overlook this, recognize that basic skills are essential. Levels of literacy and numeracy really do matter, and they need to be high. The skill demands of technology have changed, but they place increased weight on the ability to problem solve, to communicate clearly with language. And that means that universities and other advanced skills agencies need to be fully engaged with the mainstream school system. We need advanced technical skills, but we need them to build on basic skills. At Sheffield Hallam, we've launched a strong education alliance with schools and local authorities across our region, which we've called South Yorkshire Futures, because we recognise that we all have a stake in ensuring that basic skill levels rise, irrespective of whether those students are going to progress to advanced technical or higher education. Thirdly, it's really important to work with others in an open, collaborative, and generous spirited way to co-design learning. We all work in systems which were, as I've said, built for other times. We all have suboptimal institutional structures. We can become too constrained by organisations. We all need to work with others in imaginative ways. The task of leaders in a system like that is fundamentally to remove the barriers to imaginative collaboration, to ensure the co-design of learning between employers and educational institutions. Fourth, recognise that employers are absolutely key to the future of vocational education. But as I've said, they don't have any better answers than anybody else. Listen hard, respect the views of employers, and engage with them on their own terms. We've established a very senior, very powerful business and employer engagement directorate, which is one of our 3 main directorates. And we've staffed it with outward-facing business engaged staff. We've put in place a Vice-Chancellor for business engagement who leads our strategic thinking about business engagement, putting at the heart of every decision that the university makes. Number 5, make mistakes, but learn from them. The future is unpredictable. Things will go wrong. Error is your friend. Encourage rapid innovation and quick feedback loops. Our biggest mistake over a suite of sub-degree programs wasn't listening hard enough to early feedback. And it took us a year to dig ourselves out of a problem that we could have avoided if we'd listened better. 6, build active links between on-the-job and off-the-job work, between on-the-job learning and off-the-job learning. Experience, as I say on the slide, isn't learning. Learning in the workplace needs to be actively managed. Our degree apprentices are full-time employees. We don't believe that they have a job for 80% of the time and learning for 20% of their time. We seek to integrate learning through careful planning, preparation, through a network of learning coaches who work with learners and trainers, delivery, and through practical, authentic assessment. feedback. These three things need to be lined up. They're really important. And if they're misaligned, messages get very confused in the system. And finally, and my overwhelming point, I said it earlier, put learners at the heart of it all. Look at the world through the eyes of the learner, not the qualification or the institution or the rules or the structure. We're helping employees and learners navigate through an uncertain world, and we owe it to them to put their perspectives first. It's important for institutions, but it's also important for governments and regulators. It should shape funding, and it should shape accountability measures. I've tried at high speed to work through my learning about making high quality vocational education work in a complex university structure and a complex educational setting. I'm really sorry, as I said at the beginning, that I'm not with you to talk about these ideas, for you to challenge directly and for us to work them through, and for me to improve these ideas through active engagement with you. But I hope that this pretty quick canter through my learning has been helpful for you. Thank you very much indeed for listening.